Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another wonderful biology class. I am so glad you're here. Today, we're going to be looking at genetics and patterns of inheritance, all of the good things. And today's big question to think about while we're going through this is why are pedigrees helpful when analyzing the inheritance of families or traits through multiple generations? The new vocabulary for today include carrier and pedigree, but there will also be some complicated names of some diseases that you might want to know. Review vocabulary for today is genes, which are segments of DNA that code for one or more proteins. Good stuff, we like it. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. When looking at genetics, and we're looking at inheritance from one generation to the next, disorders tends to be a topic of interest because you might not want to have, say, an inherited form of cancer. And so you have two different types of people. You have people who don't have the disorder, well, three actually. You have people who do have the disorder, and you have what are called carriers, which are oftentimes people who have an allele for the disorder, but it's a recessive allele, and therefore they don't express the disorder symptoms. Now, to figure out who is a carrier and who is not a carrier, a pedigree can be useful to do this. And a pedigree has a diagram that has a square for the male, a circle for the female, lines connecting those individuals who mate, and then connecting them to the number of offspring they have, squares for boys, circles for girls. And in a pedigree, you have a blank white color for individuals who don't have the disease, and a solid color for those who do. Once you've figured out who the carriers are, the pedigree then has a half color for those who are carriers. And it's important to note that your pedigrees aren't just for humans. There are many individuals who have rather lengthy pedigrees for multiple breeding generations of dogs. So if you want to have a thoroughbred dog that is a very specialized dog, you can have a pedigree that shows that that dog came through this generation or came from these parents who had these traits. And so you can do some really nice genetic mapping. This is also done with horses that are used in horse racing. Now, recessive genetic disorders are the type that we most commonly find in the world. So this pedigree, or the pedigree that would have been here, is one of Tay-Sachs disease and has two unaffected parents with an affected child. And so for a recessive disorder, someone with Tay-Sachs disease would have to have two parents that are carriers if they didn't express the disease themselves. And 25% of their offspring would show the disorder because it's like a dihybrid cross where you're crossing two heterozygotes and you get a 75 to 25 phenotypic ratio. Okay, 25% of the children will have the disorder, 50% will be carriers, and 50% will not have the allele for the disorder at all. Now, dominant genetic disorders are expressed every time the allele is present. Okay, and so sickle cell anemia would be a good example of this because even though you have a healthy allele producing normal red blood cells, you also have a that's a codominant. That's actually a bad example. So when we're talking about sickle cell anemia, it's a codominant disease. So to have a full-blown expression of it, you have to have both dominant or both sickle cell alleles. Because it's a codominant disorder, people who have one normal allele and one sickle cell allele produce both normal round red blood cells and abnormal crescent moon-shaped blood cells. Now, an example of a disorder that is dominant would be something like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, where you only need one allele that has this disorder for you to express it. Now, usually these types of disorders wind up in death early on, so they tend to be kind of rare and they don't get passed very easily. But for the most part, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a really sad disorder because people who have it, well, they wind up surviving till about 20, 21, 22. And then the disease onsets rapidly and they die very quickly thereafter. So they seem totally normal and healthy until all of a sudden they're not. And it causes a degeneration of the brain tissue and inevitably death after that because there's no cure or treatment for it. Now, inferring genotypes is very important when you're talking about disorders because being able to know whether or not you're at risk for a disease is useful, right? So when you go to a doctor, one thing they'll do is ask you about your family history and kind of build a pedigree based on your answers. And in doing so, they can kind of guess. So if you have two parents that have no symptoms of a disease and a child that has the disease, you can infer that they're both carriers. If you have a parent who has the disease and a parent who does not have the disease, you can infer you can predict whether or not their children, or you can infer whether or not the person who doesn't have the disease is a carrier based on the phenotypic ratio of the offspring, right? So if someone who has the disease, they're going to be homozygous recessive. Someone who doesn't have it could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. If they're heterozygous, then half the children will have the disease and half will not. If they're homozygous dominant, meaning that they're not carriers, none of the children will have the disease, but they will all be carriers. And so you can predict disorders as well if you know the pedigrees of individuals. Because again, if you know that two people are heterozygous carriers, you can predict 25% of the children will have the disease. If you know for sure that one person is absolutely free of the disorder, homozygous dominant, then none of the kids are going to have the disorder. So let's look at some of these genetic traits. And the first is albinoism. Albinoism is a recessive disorder. It results in the absence of pigment or colors from the skin, hair, and eyes. People who have this tend to be affected by light sensitivity because the pigments in the eyes, as the iris closes in response to light, it tends to block out some of the light that's coming in. Well, it turns out when your iris is translucent because there's no pigments, that doesn't work so well. And so your ability to block out light is lessened, and so you have light sensitivity. They also tend to get sunburns pretty badly, pretty easily. There's no treatment for it, obviously. But wearing glasses when you go outside and making sure to wear sunscreen or long sleeve clothing, you can have a pretty normal life, other than the fact that you look a little weird. And clearly this person is either wearing contacts or is not a true albino, even though they have white hair, because a true albino would not have red lips. This must be makeup in this case, and contacts to give color to the eyes because the eyes would have a reddish hue to them due to the lack of pigment. So you would actually see the reflection of light from the vasculature, the blood vessels in the eyes, and it would make the eyes look red, not green like they are in this picture. Cystic fibrosis is a very nasty disease that causes the overproduction and thickening of mucus in the respiratory system. People tend to die of this before they reach 20 because of bacterial infections in the respiratory system leading to pneumonia. However, with constant treatments that are aerosolized, you breathe them in, the mucus can be thinned and the body can then excrete it. There have been individuals who have lived past 20. In fact, the life expectancy for someone with cystic fibrosis has increased markedly in the last 20 years because the treatments have become more and more effective and more available to more people. So it's still a nasty disorder. It's going to leave you with a life that is very dependent on going to hospitals and expensive, to be honest, because the medical treatments and going there is a costly thing. So a person can survive with this into their 20s, 30s, 40s now, but generally speaking, not the easiest life. Now, galactosemia is an interesting disease where your body does not have the enzyme to break down glucose, which is in just about everything, right? Glucose is the base sugar for most substances. And so the inability to break that down causes some real problems. Kidney failure, swollen liver, just to name a few. Because of the chances of kidney failure, you have to go on dialysis. Treatments tend to be with diet, and there's no cure. And obviously, cutting out all sugar, all glucose, is really, really hard because, again, just about everything has trace amounts of it. So, a nasty disease indeed. Now, Tay-Sachs disease is the absence of necessary enzymes that break down fatty acids or fatty substances. And so, what does this cause? Well, it causes the buildup of fatty stuff in the brain, which leads to obviously mental and cognitive decline over time. There's no cure, and people tend to die from this around age 5 because there's no effective treatments as well. Again, a very nasty disease. Huntington's disease is a gene or a defect in a gene that affects the neurological and cognitive functions of an individual. It tends to be degenerative over time. The ability to control muscles, the ability to control speech and thought also decline. Ability to move decreases over time. There's no cure or treatment, and people do tend to die rather young from this. Achondroplasia is an interesting disease. It has to do with a defect in a gene that relates to bone growth. And so you tend to have shortened arms, shortened legs, and an enlarged head. There's no treatment, though this doesn't tend to be fatal. It just causes a lot of pain and discomfort pretty much your entire life. All right, and so that brings us back to the question that we started with. Why is a pedigree helpful in analyzing the inheritance patterns through multiple generations? And hopefully you now have some tools to answer that question. All right, that was good. Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions, of course, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.